It's 793 AD. The northern coast of England is about to experience one of history's most jarring wake-up calls. Monks at Lindisfarne Monastery are going about their daily routines when screams erupt from the harbor. Ships, unlike anything they'd ever seen, are slicing through the water. Warriors with axes and shields pour onto the beach. Within hours, the most sacred, most protected monastery in all of Christendom has been razed to the ground. This wasn't just a raid, it was a warning that the old world was ending. For the next 3 centuries, Vikings would appear seemingly from nowhere, strike with devastating precision, and vanish back across the sea. They terrified Europe, they horrified the church. They were painted as bloodthirsty savages in every chronicle that survived. But here's what historians won't tell you in that opening paragraph. The Vikings weren't just warriors. They were survivors, operating on a knowledge level that was generations ahead of their time. While medieval Europe was starving through harsh winters and losing entire populations to failed crops, Viking settlements in Greenland and Iceland were thriving. While other civilizations were struggling to cross oceans, Vikings were establishing trade routes that spanned thousands of miles. They didn't conquer the world with just violence, they conquered it with innovation. The real Viking story isn't about raids and plunder, it's about a people who developed a technological, agricultural, and navigational knowledge system so advanced that it allowed them to survive and prosper in places where everyone else would simply die. To understand how Vikings became so advanced, you first need to understand what they were up against. The Scandinavian peninsula is not kind. Short growing seasons, long, brutal winters, soil that was scraped bare by glaciers during the last ice age. The latitude ranges from about 55 degrees north in southern Denmark to nearly 70 degrees in the far north of Norway. That's well within the Arctic Circle. To put this in perspective, Stockholm, Sweden is at the same latitude as Anchorage, Alaska. Most of medieval Europe struggled with winter, but Scandinavia was something else entirely. From November through March, the sun barely rose. In some regions, it didn't rise at all for weeks at a time. Temperatures regularly dropped below freezing for months. Growing crops in this environment wasn't just difficult, it seemed impossible. For centuries, Scandinavian communities did what humans had always done in harsh climates. They adapted through sheer necessity. They became hunter-gatherers with seasonal patterns. They fished the rich waters that surrounded them. They hunted seals, whales, and whatever game they could find. They were surviving, but just barely. Then something changed. Around the 8th century, innovations began spreading north from continental Europe. Better plow designs, crop rotation techniques, animal husbandry methods. These weren't brand new discoveries. The Romans had been using many of these techniques for centuries. But as they reached Scandinavia, something remarkable happened. The Vikings didn't just adopt these techniques, they refined them, they experimented with them, they perfected them for their specific brutal climate.
Here's something that surprises most people. The Vikings became exceptionally sophisticated farmers. In fact, their agricultural knowledge exceeded that of most people in medieval Europe. In the early medieval period, the 3-field crop rotation system was revolutionary. Instead of planting the same crop in the same field year after year until the soil became exhausted, farmers would divide their land into 3 sections. The first field would grow grain in year 1, be left fallow in year 2, and grow legumes in year 3. This rotated through all 3 fields. Legumes fixed nitrogen in the soil, naturally replenishing it. Fallow periods allowed the land to recover. The Vikings didn't invent this system, but they optimized it for their climate in ways that were genuinely innovative. They discovered that certain crop varieties performed better in northern latitudes. They meticulously tracked which grains could mature in their shorter growing season. Barley and rye became their staples. Not because they preferred them, but because they were the only crops that could reliably mature before the first frost in September or early October. But here's where Viking agricultural knowledge became truly sophisticated. They developed advanced animal husbandry systems that transformed their entire economy. While other medieval societies treated livestock as a luxury or seasonal resource, the Vikings made animal agriculture the foundation of their survival strategy. In Scandinavian farms, cattle, sheep, and goats weren't just sources of meat, they were sophisticated investments in future survival. Vikings understood something that most medieval farmers had not grasped. A living animal that produces milk, wool, and eventually meat is more valuable than a slaughtered animal. They bred their livestock selectively, favoring animals that could survive the harsh winters and produce more offspring. This knowledge cascaded into related innovations. They built sophisticated barns and storage facilities designed to keep animals alive through winters that lasted 6 months. They developed hay cultivation techniques, cutting, drying, and storing grass from summer months specifically to feed animals when snow covered the ground. They understood animal nutrition in ways that were genuinely advanced for the time. The result? While peasants in England and France were losing half their livestock to winter starvation in bad years, Viking communities maintained steady populations of animals year-round. This meant consistent access to meat, milk, cheese, and wool. It meant security. It meant survival in a world that was actively trying to kill you. But superior farming and animal husbandry would have been useless without something equally crucial: the ability to preserve food through the winter. And this is where the Vikings made their most critical contribution to their own survival. Every human civilization that survived in harsh climates developed food preservation techniques. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia used smoking and drying. The Inuit used freezing. The Polynesians used fermentation. The Vikings, faced with a climate where winter could last 8 months, developed a preservation system that was remarkably comprehensive and effective. The most critical technique was salting. The Vikings understood, far better than most medieval peoples, that salt could preserve meat indefinitely if applied correctly. They didn't have a scientific understanding of why salt worked. We now know it dehydrates food and inhibits bacterial growth, but through generations of observation and refinement, they developed a process that worked. During summer, when seals and fish were abundant, they would catch enormous quantities. The fish would be split, gutted, and packed in layers with salt. The salt would draw out moisture, and the packed fish would be stored in barrels that were sealed against the elements. The result was preserved fish that could last months, sometimes up to a year. This wasn't just a food source, it was insurance against winter. But Vikings didn't rely on salting alone. They were sophisticated enough to use multiple preservation methods depending on the food. Smoking was another critical technique. They would hang meat and fish over fires fueled by specific woods. Oak and birch were preferred, that imparted flavor while drying the food. Smoked meat could be stored in cool, dry places and would remain edible for months. This technique was so effective that smoked fish and meat became a trade commodity. Norse traders demanded payment for it. Fermentation was used for dairy products. Vikings understood that milk could be transformed into cheese, which was far easier to preserve and transport than fresh milk. They didn't understand bacterial cultures, but they understood that if you controlled temperature and kept the cheese dry, it would last. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking settlements had sophisticated cheese-making operations, with specific buildings called cheese houses dedicated to the process. They even fermented grains and legumes. By allowing grain to ferment slightly, they could reduce the chance of mold developing during storage and improve digestibility. They experimented with different storage methods, gradually developing techniques that worked best in their climate. The technological sophistication here is profound. A family that could successfully preserve meat, fish, dairy, and grain had effectively defeated winter. They had transformed a seasonal food system into a year-round one. Compare this to the reality facing medieval Europe. A bad harvest in autumn could mean starvation by spring. A disease that killed livestock could wipe out an entire village. Wars disrupted the food supply and led to mass famine. In 1315 to 1317, the Great Famine killed an estimated 10% of the European population because harvests failed for 3 consecutive years. Viking communities experienced famines too, but their diversified food preservation methods and sophisticated understanding of food storage made them far more resilient. This wasn't luck, it was accumulated knowledge.
While medieval Europeans were hugging coastlines and terrified of open ocean, Vikings were crossing thousands of miles of the Atlantic Ocean in open boats. They reached Iceland around 870 AD, Greenland by 985 AD, and North America around 1000 AD, nearly 500 years before Columbus. This wasn't recklessness, it was sophisticated navigation knowledge. The Vikings developed a navigation system that didn't rely on maps or compasses. The magnetic compass wasn't yet in wide use in Europe. Instead, they read the ocean itself. They understood ocean swell patterns. Even on cloudy days when the sun was invisible, the ocean maintained swells from distant storms and weather systems. Vikings knew that if they oriented themselves relative to these swells, they could maintain a consistent course. This knowledge came from generations of observation and from careful documentation of sea routes that was passed down through oral tradition and eventually written descriptions. They tracked bird behavior. They knew that certain birds were indicators of land. When you were approaching an island or coastline, bird populations would change in predictable ways. They would see ravens, terns, and other seabirds that didn't venture far from shore. Experienced navigators could read bird activity and adjust course accordingly. They understood the sun's position relative to the seasons and their latitude. While they didn't have instruments to measure latitude precisely, they understood that the sun's height in the sky at noon changed as you moved north and south. They could estimate their latitude through observation. They used stars for nighttime navigation. Not randomly, they understood the positions of key stars in different seasons and at different latitudes. Polaris, the North Star, was a critical reference point. They understood that its angle above the horizon corresponded to your latitude. Some scholars believe Vikings may have used a tool called a sun compass or sunstone to navigate when the sun was visible but obscured by clouds. A sunstone, likely Iceland spar, a type of crystal, has optical properties that allow it to polarize light in ways that can indicate the sun's position even through cloud cover. While the evidence is controversial, multiple Viking sagas reference mysterious stones used for navigation. The critical insight: the Vikings treated navigation as a learnable skill based on observation and accumulated knowledge. They didn't have instruments, but they had techniques. They didn't have maps, but they had mental models of routes that could be communicated and improved. This navigation knowledge enabled everything else. It allowed them to establish trading networks. It allowed them to locate Greenland and Iceland in the open ocean. It allowed them to reach North America. Most importantly, it allowed them to develop a sea-based economy that brought wealth and security to northern communities that would otherwise have been trapped by geography. But navigation knowledge would have been useless without ships capable of crossing oceans. And here, the Vikings made perhaps their most remarkable contribution to human technology: the Viking ship. Medieval European ships of the 8th century were generally designed for rivers or coastal trade. They were wide, deep-drafted vessels that were stable in calm waters but difficult to maneuver. They required deep harbors and calm conditions. Viking ships were radically different. The longship design was a marvel of engineering. It was shallow-drafted, meaning it could navigate in as little as 3 feet of water. This allowed Vikings to navigate up rivers, beach on shallow shores, and raid inland targets that coastal defenders thought were safe. It was narrow and relatively lightweight, making it fast. A Viking longship could travel at speeds of 10 to 13 knots in good conditions, faster than almost any contemporary vessel. But the genius of Viking shipbuilding went deeper than just the hull shape. The construction method itself was revolutionary. Vikings used a technique called clinker construction or lapstrake construction. Instead of building a frame first and then attaching planks to it, the method most European shipbuilders used, they started with a strong keel and then overlapped planks, fastening them to each other. This created a hull that was incredibly flexible. When a wave hit, the overlapped planks would flex and move rather than crack. This flexibility was critical for surviving the rough seas of the North Atlantic. They used wooden pegs called tree nails to fasten planks together, supplemented with nails made from iron. But here's the crucial detail: they left the joints between planks deliberately slightly loose, allowing the wood to move independently. They then sealed the gaps with caulking, hammering wool or plant fibers into the gaps and then sealing everything with pine tar. This waterproofing technique was so effective that Viking ships could stay afloat in open ocean for weeks. The sail design was another innovation.
While other medieval ships used square sails that only worked efficiently when sailing with the wind, Vikings increasingly used designs that allowed them to sail closer to the wind direction. This gave them far greater navigational flexibility. The result was a vessel type that could navigate shallow rivers in summer, cross open ocean in more advanced models, operate in rough water without sinking, beach on enemy shores without a proper harbor, drag ships overland from one river system to another. Vikings famously dragged ships across land to connect different river systems. The Volga river system in Russia, for example, could be connected to the Baltic through a series of portages where ships were literally carried from one waterway to another. This allowed Vikings to reach the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and Baghdad, establishing trade routes that brought Islamic silver back to Scandinavia. This shipbuilding knowledge wasn't just militarily significant, it was economically revolutionary. It allowed Vikings to establish themselves as the preeminent traders of the medieval world. They controlled trade routes that others couldn't access. They could bring goods to markets that seemed inaccessible. By the 10th century, Viking traders had established permanent settlements in Russia, known as Varangian outposts, and controlled trade networks extending from the North Atlantic to the Middle East.
Perhaps the most underestimated aspect of Viking success was their ability to establish permanent settlements in hostile environments. When Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland in 982 AD for murder, he was forced to find somewhere else to live. He sailed west and discovered Greenland, a massive island covered almost entirely with ice. But instead of turning back, he explored the coast and found a small region with a surprisingly mild climate where plants grew and animals could be raised. He named it Greenland, deliberately choosing the name to attract settlers. It was marketing genius in the 10th century. Settlers came. By 1000 AD, Greenland had a population of 2,000 to 3,000 Vikings living in farms that produced dairy, wool, and meat. This is where the sophistication of Viking knowledge really shows. They didn't bring European farm designs to Greenland, they adopted them. They experimented with what would grow in the northern climate. They learned which animals thrived. They developed storage techniques specifically for the Greenlandic winter. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the Greenlandic settlements were self-sufficient and producing surplus goods for trade. The agricultural innovations that worked in Scandinavia were refined further for Greenland's harsher climate. The animal husbandry knowledge was applied to surviving even more extreme conditions. The food preservation techniques were perfected. The result was that Vikings were sustaining thriving communities in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Across the Atlantic, Leif Erikson established a settlement called Vinland around 1000 AD, somewhere in what is now Newfoundland or the American Northeast. The evidence from archaeology at Les Meadows shows that Vikings built structures suited to the climate and attempted to establish agriculture in the newfound land. The settlement didn't last permanently, they likely faced resource limitations and conflicts with indigenous peoples, but the fact that they reached North America, built structures, and attempted settlement is remarkable. These weren't just warriors raiding and retreating, they were colonists with sophisticated knowledge of how to establish settlements in new environments. Here's a detail that often gets overlooked. The Vikings had systematic ways of preserving and transferring knowledge across generations. In a society without printing, without universities, without written records in the early period, knowledge transfer was everything. Vikings solved this through multiple mechanisms. Apprenticeship was formalized. Young people learned trades from masters. A boy would apprentice with a shipwright or a farmer or a merchant, learning not just techniques but the reasoning behind them. The accumulated knowledge wasn't just do this, it was do this because. Storytelling preserved technical knowledge. Sagas and tales often contained embedded information about navigation routes, settlement locations, and techniques. When Eriksson's voyage to Vinland is described in the saga of Eric the Red, it includes detailed descriptions of the sailing route, the geography of the land, and the resources available. This isn't just entertainment, it's knowledge transmission device. Written records, when they came, were used specifically to preserve crucial information. Once Vikings adopted written language, they recorded things like navigation routes, trade contacts, and settlement locations.
The Landnama Book, Book of Settlements, is a written catalog of Icelandic settlements, their locations, and their founding families. It's a practical knowledge document in addition to being genealogical. Peer networks allowed knowledge to spread quickly. Trading networks brought Vikings from different regions into contact. When a shipwright from Norway encountered a trader from Russia, they shared techniques. When a farmer from Denmark traded with someone from Iceland, they discussed crops. Networks allowed innovations to spread. This systematic approach to knowledge preservation and transfer wasn't unique to the Vikings. Other civilizations had versions of it, but the Vikings were remarkably effective at it, which is why so many innovations occurred in such a relatively short time frame.
Let's return to the central question. Why did Vikings thrive where everyone else starved? The answer isn't that they were more intelligent or more capable as a people. It's that they developed a comprehensive, integrated knowledge system adapted specifically to their environment and then executed it relentlessly. Consider what a Viking family had that a medieval European family lacked. Food security. Through diversified agriculture, sophisticated animal husbandry, and advanced preservation techniques, a Viking family could reliably store enough food to last an 8-month winter. A European family, dependent on a single crop, could face famine if that crop failed. Economic opportunity. Through superior shipbuilding and navigation, Vikings could access trade routes and resources that were completely inaccessible to landlocked or port-bound peoples. A Viking could sell dried fish from Iceland or furs from Russia at markets that would pay premium prices. This created wealth. Adaptability. When one environment became crowded or resources depleted, Vikings had the knowledge and tools to establish settlements in new environments. Greenland, Iceland, North America, these weren't just raided and abandoned, they were colonized with sophisticated understanding of how to survive and eventually thrive. Technology. Better ships meant faster trade, better defense, and access to distant resources. Better agricultural techniques meant more food per acre. Better preservation methods meant less waste. Each technological advancement multiplied the benefits of the others. This is why the so-called Viking Age corresponded with a period of dramatic population growth in Scandinavia. Not because the region became more peaceful, it didn't, or more temperate, it didn't, but because the knowledge system allowed people to survive and prosper in a harsh environment. By the 11th century, when the Viking Age was ending and Scandinavians were being absorbed into larger European kingdoms, the knowledge system remained. That's why Scandinavian kingdoms became major powers in medieval Europe. Not because they conquered larger territories, but because they had stronger, wealthier populations supported by superior agriculture and trade networks. The popular image of Vikings is violence and chaos. Raiders destroying monasteries, pillaging coastal towns, spreading terror. That image isn't entirely wrong. Vikings absolutely engaged in violent raids. The Lindisfarne raid and hundreds of others like it happened. But that image is catastrophically incomplete. It's like defining all of medieval Europe by crusades and witch hunts, or defining ancient Rome by gladiator heights. It captures moments of dramatic violence while missing the underlying reality of how people actually lived. The real Viking story is quieter and more profound. It's about farmers who experimented with crop rotation until they could reliably survive winters that killed other people's livestock. It's about fishermen who spent generations learning to read ocean swells and navigate thousands of miles of open water without instruments. It's about shipwrights who designed vessels that were simultaneously nimble enough to navigate shallow rivers and strong enough to cross the North Atlantic. It's about a people who faced one of Earth's harshest climates, and instead of accepting starvation and hardship as inevitable, they developed knowledge systems that made them prosperous. These weren't people with access to universities or scientific institutions. Most Vikings in the early medieval period were illiterate. They didn't have compasses or maps or advanced tools. What they had was systematic observation, a willingness to experiment, and a culture that valued and preserved practical knowledge. And somehow, that was enough. More than enough. It was revolutionary. When we look at Vikings today, we tend to focus on their military impact or their exploration.
We talk about their conquests and their raids and their discovery of North America. Those things matter. But the thing that actually made Vikings successful, the thing that allowed them to build settlements that lasted centuries in some of the harshest places on Earth, was knowledge. Knowledge of how to grow food in impossible conditions, knowledge of how to preserve it for 8 months of winter, knowledge of how to navigate across open ocean, knowledge of how to build ships that could survive North Atlantic storms, knowledge of how to establish communities in new lands and make them work. This knowledge wasn't magic, it wasn't divine inspiration, it was accumulated, refined, and transmitted through generations. It was the result of careful observation of what worked and what didn't. It was innovation born from necessity. That's why the Vikings thrived where everyone else starved. Not because they were more ruthless or more violent, but because they were willing to learn, willing to adapt, and willing to systematically apply that knowledge to survival. That's a lesson that extends far beyond the Viking Age.